I need a dollar, 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 that's what I need. Hey, hey. Well, I need a dollar, 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 that's what I need. Hey, hey. Said I need a dollar, 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 that's what I need.
So we're here at the event team, ready to catch up with Terry Theise. My son caught something in our last blog, which is 8 by 10, perfect square. So he's riveted me about it. So he's our biggest fan. We're going to be talking a little bit about wine cellars with Terry. We're going to be talking a lot of German wine and just the wine industry in whole. So I think you guys will love it.
Long old troublesome road, and I'm looking for.
So we're here catching up in New York City with world famous Terry Theise, whose book I would highly recommend, which is called Reading Between the Wines. And we'll link to that up on Amazon. Good to see you, my friend.
Good to be here. Thanks for having me. I, by the way, would also highly recommend the book. We have 2 copies of it here. That's one less for you all to buy.
Where would you like to go with this?
Wherever you want to take me.
I'd like to start
I'm
with.
passive.
I'd like to start with what is a thought Twinkie?
A thought Twinkie. A thought Twinkie is typically an assertive statement masquerading as something that thought has gone into, but actually offering nothing other than sugar, chemicals, and empty calories.
Okay.
There are a lot of them out there, and the internet has been a rich and fecund environment for thought Twinkies to spring up like mushrooms after a rainy week.
What do you think about points?
I have a long essay in the book about point scores. I think that points obviously are here to stay. From the strict consumerist standpoint, they must be useful to readers or else they wouldn't have metastasized the way they have. But there's an inherent limitation with all point systems, which is that they can only address how wine is judged, but they really can't address the question of how wine is used. So the classic example of that would be if you've ordered a platter of fresh raw oysters, and you have an option of 2 different wines. One of them is a very light Muscadet or Sancerre, let's say, typical classic sort of 86 or 87 point wine. And the other is a very big, let's say it's Puy-Fumé, that got 93 or 94 points and has 13.5 or 14% alcohol and maybe a little new wood, et cetera, et cetera. It is the better wine if it's evaluated strictly as wine qua wine, but it's not going to be the better wine to wash those 12 oysters down with. So you have to consider, to really look at wine in the wholeness of its being, not only how it's judged strictly in and of itself and on tables with a bunch of other wines, but also how it's going to be used. The wine that you need at any given moment is the wine that suits the purpose of any given moment, and that may not necessarily be the highest scoring wine. The other issue I have with point systems is that they presuppose the notion of perfection. You remember for years and years and years, Gold Mio, which has a 20-point scale for evaluating restaurants, would never award a chef 20 points because they said perfection was unattainable. So the highest they would ever go was 19.5. Then they must have had some kind of spasm and they relented and they gave Marc Verrat 20 points. Mm-hmm. And I just thought, when it happened, I thought, well, of course, it's a very dramatic gesture. They have decided that there is perfection somehow on this earth, that this human being is capable not only of having attained it, but of maintaining it. And then I thought, but what happens when inevitably, at some point, they find a restaurant that they like just a little bit better?
Right, 20.5.
Now they're stuck.
Right.
What are they going to do, 20.5? So whenever you start to posit the notion of a perfect wine, it's always a slippery slope because somehow, sometime or another, you're going to give a wine 100 points or 20 points or whatever your scale is, and then inevitably find something that you like that much more. So all of a sudden your scale becomes elastic, but that's just it's in the nature of human pleasure. David Schulknecht, who's a wine writer I like and respect, and David's an old friend of mine, has a really good way of kind of dealing with this problem. He says the notion of perfection is a relativistic notion. He says we feel that feeling when we taste something better than which at that moment cannot be imagined. And that's when we say, okay, I have such a profound and powerful feeling of admiration or love or whatever for this wine, and I need to find a symbolic gesture that's equal to the power of my emotion, and that symbolic gesture is the 100 points, because you think it can't get better than this.
Right.
But the only way to answer that question is, can't get better than this, is, really?
Right.
How do you know?
A lot of wines out there.
A lot of wines out there. A lot of yous out there, too.
Yeah.
You know? So every now and again I'll see on the internet that people have put together tastings of 100-point wines. And I'd like to think that they're doing it to kind of give themselves this ecstatic, excessive flush of pleasure. But more often than not, I tend to think that as soon as a wine gets 100 points, that wine now has a chip on its shoulder. And there's a certain kind of taster that's going to open the bottle and go, 100 points, huh? Well, we'll see about that.
Right.
So, you know, that's another unwanted consequence of having any kind of evaluative scale that has a notion of perfection at its top. So you ask a small question and you get a big answer. I'm not always this way.
Some of the more influential people in your life?
In my life or in my wine life?
Either.
Huh.
How long has wine been in your life? Let's go to there first.
Well, wine's been in my life since I was 25, and that's when, well, wine, I mean, it casually was in my life from the time that I was about 17. But it became something that I was seriously enamored of when I was in my mid-20s, and I was living in Germany at the time. And
did you have that moment of?
I had that moment, and it had to do both with what was in my glass and also with some of what I was reading. And so I was very fortunate to be in the old world, and I had time at my disposal where I could visit wine regions. Since I was in Germany, German wine regions were the ones that were closest to me, so they were the ones I went to first. So I sometimes say...
Now you were living there not doing something with wine.
Had nothing to do with wine. I went over as a hippie bum, basically, and ended up working for the Department of Defense, which,
nice.
Yeah, which had jobs available that they couldn't fill with active duty military. So you could just be, you know, a backpacker hippie bum type and just apply in some places and fortunately, you know, get work.
Right.
So, and it was, I mean, in many respects, a kind of a perfect life. It was a very low-key, interesting life. I lived in a furnished apartment, U.S. Army furniture, didn't have a car, didn't even have a telephone. You know, his life was really stripped to a degree of simplicity that I can't imagine now. But it gave me kind of space. It gave me time and psychic space, where something like wine could come into my life, and I had very few distractions. I didn't have a television,
Right.
so
No Twitter.
no Twitter, nothing of the kind. So I was able to delve into it. And I mean, look, we know how guys are. When we get into something, we become completely deranged. And the passion and the infatuation for wine was something that just occupied my entire being for 4 years. And unfortunately, it tended to occupy whatever being of whatever person happened to get too close to me, because you know how it is when you're just starting out with wine. You become the world's worst wine bore. It's all you can talk about.
Yep.
You want to share with everybody this incredible new thing that you found. So, but your question was who had influenced me. I was influenced by good wine writers and good thinkers, particularly people like Hugh Johnson, Gerald Asher, were all great influences on me. Once I got into the trade, of course, I was influenced by many of the growers with whom I came into contact.
Did you just get in a car and start driving too?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you know, I had read in Hugh Johnson, among other places, and I went out actually not looking for producers. I went out looking for terroir. So if I had heard, for example, that Gracher Himmelreich and Gracher Domprops were great Mosel vineyards, then I drove my car to Grach, and I parked it at the end of the village, and I just went and rang doorbells.
Wow.
You know, growers had their signs out, Weingut so-and-so, and sometimes they had little price lists in the window, and I thought, oh, this guy looks like he has something interesting, and just knocked on the door.
That's cool.
And made my way through the villages. And so, and that was how I really got into it. It's how I did it everywhere I went, to the extent that it was possible to do. So,
when did it start, not to interrupt you, but when did it start that you thought you could make almost the importing and turn it into a business or some sort of?
well, we came back to the U.S. 5 years later, and it was because my then wife insisted that we had to come back. At that point, you know, I had thought it'd be nice to be able to make a living writing about wine, but I was smart enough, at least at that point, to realize that there were very few people who were making a living writing about wine. Even Bob Parker wasn't making a living as a writer at that point. And unless you were born into wealth in the UK, it didn't seem as if it was going to be possible at all. So I knew I was going to need to get into the business, and that actually then takes me to another really powerful influence that might surprise people who know my work and his, but Bobby Katcher was a gigantic influence on me. Though we have many areas where we kind of diverge philosophically, I nonetheless have unqualified respect for Bobby. He comes by his opinions by dint of real diligence, real rubber hits the road, feet on the groundness. And even if I don't agree with Bobby, he has not obtained his opinions. He hasn't taken any shortcuts. What he feels passionately, and he has every right to feel what he feels. I became really struck by his work ethic, and I became really struck by his doggedness. Not only his doggedness as a salesperson, but also his doggedness in wanting to understand what it is that he was doing. So Katcher was a really
Almost
huge
passion.
Yeah, and Katcher was a really big influence on me. In a way, once I got into the business, Bobby was an even larger influence on me than were certain other people whom I might have been philosophically closer to. So, I mean, I have tremendous admiration for Kermit Lynch, of course, and for Neil Rosenthal, and for any number of artisan importers who are fighting the good fight, each in their own ways. But by the time, I became aware of their existence, I had a set of values that was, if not fully formed, was certainly pretty far along the process of coalescing. Bobby kind of shook me a little off my moorings, because here was somebody who felt very profoundly, but felt very differently than I did. So that was good for me.
Got you to think outside of.
Exactly, it got me to think outside of my own particular frame of reference. So I owe a tremendous debt to Bobby, and I look for opportunities to tell him so. Even though he and I lived in the same city for many years, our paths didn't cross, and I think that's kind of part of the psychosis of Washington, is it's very difficult to maintain kind of friendships or social relationships in that town for whatever reason, I don't know. Maybe it was I who was the unavailable misanthrope, I'm not exactly sure. But if this gets to Katcher, then I'd like him to know that he is and remains a hero of mine.
Awesome.
Yep.
Before we started rolling, we were kind of just sitting, catching up, and we talked everything from David Ortiz giving Yankee fans a hug
Yes.
through the city when they played and swept the Yankees a couple weeks ago.
They did sweep the Yankees, didn't
Yeah,
they? My Boston Red Sox.
They're playing good ball now.
I need a dollar, dollar.
When I started really getting into wine in the late 70s, early 80s, even an impecunious fellow like me could afford the occasional splurge on a bottle of class growth Bordeaux. It's easy for me to say. Burgundy wasn't so easy, but if you saved your shekels, you were once in a while able to splurge on a bottle of Burgundy with pedigree. All the good Italian stuff was affordable. Even Brunello di Montalcino was affordable. Rioja was a bargain.
Right.
And now I think people who are just getting into wine cannot afford those benchmarks. So in that sense, they really have no idea how to form the proper templates to see what great wine is actually supposed to taste like.
Right.
And the prices for these wines have risen much, much faster than inflation. And I find it actually quite melancholy. And the fact of the matter is, that I can't even really afford to buy Barolo and Barbaresco at this point of the quality level that I'd like to have.
Sure.
And, then let alone the question of having to keep it for 20, 25 years before it's really ready to drink.
Yep.
So I find it kind of sad. Maybe you could say that there's a collateral benefit, which is that young people are much more ecumenical in their wine exploration, but there's a reason that the classics are classics. And, a lot of times I think that young people, when they hear the word classic, they equate it with something that's kind of, stodgy or dull or not edgy or something like that. But in my opinion, the reason that classic wines are classic